Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Laurent Lemeur from Media Lab again. So this afternoon we will speak about OPDS, technical questions, but very interesting for everybody managing libraries, managing catalogs of ebooks. To speak about OPDS, we have with us Adrien Garder. Adrien Garder has been co-founder of Feedbooks and is now in charge of the key products of the mark, including the hub, Biblius, the reader, which is the new name for Aldico, the Feedbooks line, which is now called Market, and the boutique products, so all main products of the mark. Adrien is also one of the founders and board member of IDEA Lab. And he is also very active in the Ridium community and is the main architect of the new Ridium architecture. Michael Menu will be the moderator today. Michael is lead developer at the mark and maintainer of Ridium Mobile. So I will leave the floor to Adrien directly. Adrien.
Hello. Thank you, Laurent, for the introduction. So I'm glad to present this topic today. So I'm sure that a lot of you are wondering what OPDS actually stands for. It's a long series of letters. It actually stands for Open Publishing Distribution System. And the goal of OPDS is to really facilitate the distribution of ebooks and audiobooks. So I'll start by going back a little bit and going through a bit of history. So we could actually trace back the very beginning of the work on OPDS with the launch of Feedbooks in 2006. So Feedbooks was really the first repository of EPUB files. So before that, there were probably about a dozen EPUB files out there, mostly test files. It was really the first time that we had hundreds of EPUB files available. And back then, I started working on this by thinking that it would be actually nice to have an API where people could access those EPUB files easily. So it really started off with the idea of we need to have an API to access those publications. And this was mostly around the use of the usual metadata that people are aware of, stuff like Dublin Core, for instance. But it really became something more and closer from what OPDS is today when we started collaborating with an app called Stanza. So Stanza was one of the very first EPUB reader and e-reading app in general on iOS. It launched at the same time as the iOS App Store in 2008, and it immediately became extremely successful. A lot of people had doubts back then that people would actually read at all on smartphones, and Stanza is really the app that proved a lot of people wrong. Some of you may even remember Steve Jobs saying people will never read on their smartphones or such comments. And basically, between, around 2007, we started working together with the developer behind Stanza, Marc Prudomo, in enhancing what was started just for Feedbooks into a more generic API for accessing EPUB, and EPUB in particular, and publications in general. And given the success of Stanza and this idea that people actually want an easy way to access publications and EPUB files on smartphones, on tablets, on any form factor, this became something bigger. So in 2009, we had a meeting, an in-person meeting, those still existed back in those days, where a number of us joined forces, discussed what we wanted to do, and that was where the OPDS project was announced. So a number of different additional third parties got involved. So that's when Adobe started getting involved. That's where the Internet Archive started getting involved, O'Reilly. So a number of organizations um, started working on this project. It took a little less than a year from there to release a first publication, first specification, OPDS 1.0. And then a year after that, we improved that specification um, to provide more advanced way of browsing through a catalog, sorting, filtering a catalog with OPDS 1.1. And after the release of those two first versions of OPDS, we saw a lot of adoption, especially for independent apps. So we saw a lot of app being released first on the App Store and then on the Play Store that started implementing OPDS. So I think by 2012, there was probably at least a dozen, and it grew over time to over 100 apps that really support OPDS. And there was also a lot of traction for specific type of content. So I think public domain content is one of the things that really made it popular in the first place. But we started seeing a little bit more diversity in the type of content available over the years. And in 2016, one thing that made a huge difference for the OPDS ecosystem was actually the launch of the Simply E application in the US. So Simply E is an app created by libraries for libraries in the US that is actually part of a larger project called Library Simplified. And it was really the first time that public libraries started using OPDS. So whenever someone uses Simply E to browse a collection of titles, to borrow them, all of this is completely handled with OPDS. And that was really what we wanted to do with OPDS in general. So it was a huge step forward for the ecosystem when this was launched. So that's a bit of history. So as you can see, OPDS is actually, even 1.0 is actually 10 years old, but it continues to evolve a lot. It is an open ecosystem, so anyone can implement it, anyone can use OPDS. And over time, with the adoption recently of libraries, we've seen a lot of changes in how people use it. And that's one of the things I'm going to be focusing on today. Just to explain a bit what's the point of OPDS. So at the core of OPDS, the idea is fairly simple. Everyone has a device that they can read on. So the one device that made a huge difference, I think, was the launch of the Kindle in 2007. I think that's 7, where the device was, the first Kindle was always connected. So that was a bit of a novelty back then. And the idea was very simple. The idea is just, I want to have content that flows on my device super easily. I don't want to go through 10 or 20 steps to get a book. I need to be able to browse through millions of books, download that book, and read it on my device as easily as possible. And over the years, this has become basically how we consume media in general. That's true for books, but it's true for music, it's true for video. People want an easy experience where content just flows to their device. But usually this simplicity, a lot of times these days, comes at the expense of flexibility. So it's possible to get a super nice, seamless user experience with a lot of ebook retailers, for instance, or even with some specific library systems, but you get trapped in the sense that their super seamless experience is only with their own content. If you actually want to read your books that you've bought somewhere in the same place that you read your library books, oftentimes you can't do that because you're kind of trapped in these ecosystems. And that is very different to how we actually buy print books. With print books, I'm available to just go out, buy one book from one retailer, buy another book from another retailer, buy a third one online. I can borrow a book at my public library. I can borrow another book at an academic library, for instance, and they can all sit together on my desk or in the same shelf. So there's really this idea that, well, we expect to be able to do that with physical books, but not with ebooks, unfortunately. And OPDS is really about those two things coming together. So it's the idea of having a simple experience, something that's easy to use, and at the same time that gives you the flexibility to decide where you get content from, how you get content from those different places. So some content you're going to be buying, some content is going to be open access, some of it are going to be loans from a library. You can mix all those together in the same place. And also the idea that you can select what's the reading experience. So it's not because you want to borrow a book from one public library that you want to have just one way of reading those books. So it's really separating the concept of reading from the concept of acquiring content and giving you freedom to decide all of those things. If you look at the main features of OPDS, so I'm just going to show a few examples of how this looks like in Aldico with an OPDS2 catalog. So one of the first feature of OPDS is you can create nice homepage for your catalog or multiple homepages, depending on how you want to curate content. And it looks and feels very similar to the way it would browsing Netflix or Spotify or kind of any other similar apps these days. So the idea is we want to have something that can be created by the catalog provider, and they can decide what to push forward, how to organize the catalog. They're completely in control. And one important aspect is that in OPDS, you only structure the content. So the content, how it's displayed, is actually going to change depending on which app you're using, depending on the size of the device you're using. So if you take a look at the same example, so that's the homepage for feedbooks, but on Android, it's going to look a little bit different. So this time it's a smartphone, but it's still the same concept. It's still the same OPDS catalog. It's just that each app can adapt the design to the OS they're using. And you can also use another app. So that's another example of a homepage. That's the homepage of the NYPL catalog. And that's a good example of curation. You can see they've created lists for escapist fiction, for example. That's definitely adapted to the current situation. So that's an important one, the ability to create your catalog. Another one that is pretty simple, but important as well, is the ability to browse a catalog. So in a catalog, you can have millions of titles potentially. So you have the ability to easily scroll through content, but you can also use facets. So the catalog can enable, can let you filter for content, can let you reorder your content however you see fit. So it's really designed to have massive catalogs that you can browse through in a nice way. You can also search. So OPDS 1 only had the concept of using keyword search. So you type a number of keywords and it returns a number of books. But OPDS 2 also introduced the ability of using advanced search. So if you want to look for a specific author or for a specific publisher, you can do all those things with OPDS 2 as well. It's not just limited to keywords, although keywords remain the main way people actually search in OPDS catalogs. And last but not least, there's also this concept of a bookshelf. So the concept of a bookshelf in OPDS is that there's one place where you can find all the content that you've previously acquired. So if you're using the OPDS catalog for a retailer, that means that you're going to find all the books you've bought at this retailer. But if you're using the bookshelf for a public library, as here, that's the example actually. In this example, you can see we have, sorry, it's in French, you have loans and you have holds. So it's still the same concept. It's always the idea that these are the books that I've acquired. It doesn't matter really how you acquire them. And it's an easy way to download those books, get them. This way, if I switch to another device, it's going to be very easy for me to just download those same books. Or if I've archived a book that I read 2 years ago and I want to download it again, you can also do this easily. And of course, as mentioned here, it's for ebooks, audiobooks. OPDS is actually completely agnostic when it comes to publication format. So it can be pretty much any publication format you want. So when I was looking back at the history of OPDS, I mentioned so 2010 and 11 for the release of OPDS 1 and 1.1. More recently, we've been working on a draft called OPDS 2.0. So for some of you that have attended some previous talks for this session, for the Digital Publishing Conference, you might have heard about Redium, the open source project. And OPDS 2.0 is actually built on top of one of the core components of the Redium project called the Redium Web Publication Manifest, which is basically a JSON representation of what a publication is. And more specifically, it's built on top of JSON-LD and schema.org. So for those of you who are not aware of what schema.org is, it's actually a set of metadata that's widely used over the web to provide information about anything. So one benefit of that approach is that while OPDS was previously built on top of Atom and Dublin Core, which was a very limited set of metadata, being aligned with schema.org opens the door to a lot more metadata. So we have a lot more ability to describe publications with OPDS 2. Another thing that's quite important about the OPDS 2 work is that in 2020, we're not really expecting that people will always download files. So when OPDS was started in the early, well, in 2008 and 9, the idea was very much that I want to browse a catalog, I want to download an EPUB, and then I want to read it. That's not necessarily true anymore. The line between something that you download and something that you stream, it doesn't really necessarily make sense anymore. A good example of that are audiobooks. Audiobooks can be pretty massive. An audiobook could be 1 or 2 gigabytes, for example. So you don't always want to download your content first, and OPDS 2 takes that into consideration. And another thing we've also been focusing on with OPDS 2 is that basically we know that how people browse through content has evolved. They expect something that's more visual, that's nicer, with a lot more way to curate content, to push things forward. So we've also worked on improving that part of OPDS with OPDS 2. So OPDS itself is completely built in 2 different SDKs that is maintained by the Redium Foundation. In Redium Mobile, you have a built-in parser for OPDS 1 and OPDS 2. So that's available in Swift and Kotlin. And from a developer perspective, so an organization creating a reading app, it completely abstracts away a lot of the complexity in OPDS. So you don't really need to know whether something is OPDS 1 or 2. It handles all that for you and present that with an in-memory structure that's super easy to use. So it really makes the life of developers working on this extremely easy compared to what existed before for handling OPDS. And OPDS is also supported in Redium Desktop. So this morning, I know that Daniel had talk about Thorium Reader, and that he actually did a live presentation of the OPDS feature of Thorium. So if you're interested in seeing how OPDS can also be used on desktop and not just mobile, like I've shown in the previous screenshots, you can definitely go on YouTube, look at that presentation, and you'll see another example of how OPDS can be handled. Aside from the very core of OPDS, another thing we've been focused on these last 2 years, I'd say, is the idea of handling authentication. So authentication in general is something very difficult to handle. Most of the time, there's an expectation that when an app handles authentication with a catalog, that they already know each other. So it's going to be an app for retailer A connecting to catalog A. And that's really not aligned with the idea we have with OPDS. In OPDS, we want any reading app to connect to any catalog. So this is an attempt to solve that issue using a standard JSON document. One of the things we handle with authentication for OPDS is that we're capable of discovering which type of authentication are actually available. So one catalog could be using OAuth 2, another catalog could be using basic auth. Thanks to this document, we can discover that, we can know what's available, and also we can also discover the URIs to interact with this. So that's something that's not covered by existing specifications like OAuth. With OAuth, there's no easy way of discovering how to interact with an OAuth catalog. Another important thing with authentication that's handled here is that we contextualize things a lot. So when you need to log in to a library, for instance, that means that you're going to be able to see the name of the library, you're going to see a logo, you're going to see a color for that library. So it helps to customize those things through additional context. Third thing we cover is the ability to localize fields. So instead of having just username and password displayed, it could say barcode and PIN, or it could say that in Spanish or in German. It can completely adapt to the language used by the device to localize things. And the last one, which is also quite important, is we can provide help. So you can also include a number where someone could call, an email, that kind of information. So with all that information, it really makes authentication in a decentralized way possible. And as far as I'm aware, there's not a lot of solutions for that. They're usually a lot more specialized than what has been built for that. And if you take some of those things together, so if you take OPDS2 together with this concept of authentication for OPDS, it becomes possible to create some really nice experience. And one very nice way to illustrate that is how you can actually combine OPDS with VMLCD. So for those of you who are not aware of what VMLCD is, it's an alternate DRM scheme that's non-proprietary. It's also controlled by the Redium Foundation. It's certified by ADR Lab, and it's based on the passphrase. So the usual flow with Redium LCP is I download a license, it asks a passphrase, so I have to enter something, and then I can read my book. So that's already much nicer than Adobe ACS, for instance, but we can make it even nicer with OPDS. By combining the two, you can create something that's completely seamless, where there are only two steps. So we've actually implemented all that with prenumeric.ca. So that's what I'm actually going to show you is not a prototype. It's actually something that we use in production with hundreds of libraries in Quebec. And you only have two steps. So step one is you basically browse the catalog, you borrow a book. So here you can see I've just borrowed Kiruna, the Maëlys de Kerangal. So it says your loan will expire by the end of June. And then you can simply press read, and that's it. So there's no pop-up. It doesn't ask you for a passphrase. It doesn't require any account. It's really completely seamless, and that's the goal here. The goal is we want to create something that's completely seamless, completely transparent for the user, um, and with the addition of a PDS, we can make something simple. VMLCD is much more simple than other DRM schemes, even more seamless. Behind the scene, in OPDS, we have the ability to say that an ebook or an audiobook is LCP protected. So it's not just for EPUB, we can also use that for audiobooks or PDF. So this way, our app knows that we're using LCP to protect the content. When you borrow or buy something, you actually get OPDS back. And in that OPDS entry describing a publication, we actually have a hash of the passphrase, which is why there's no need to ask you for any additional information. You can simply start reading your ebook immediately with that. And last point, one thing that's also very important with OPDS is that OPDS is pretty much accessible by default. The reason for that is it's only structured information. So I've shown you very visual example, where you have covers, where you have something very visual. But the reality is that clients are completely free to adapt how a catalog is presented. So what one could imagine browsing an OPDS catalog with a voice assistant or TTS or pretty much anything. OPDS is pure structure. So the homepage, for instance, we have structured navigation, we have structured group of content. So it's all structured that can be presented any way you want. And when you look at a specific publication, it's also strictly structured metadata. So it's not like HTML where you're only going to have an H1 or something like that. In OPDS, you'll know exactly what is the title, what's the author. Everything is always structured. With OPDS 2, the fact that we're using schema.org also opens the door to a lot of additional metadata specifically for accessibility. So it's possible in schema.org to say things like this publication has been certified by a specific organism, or this publication is visual. So all those information available in schema.org can also be represented in OPDS. So if you want to do the extra step and include them, they become available to clients that will be able to know that this is accessible and have those information available. As I mentioned before, although OPDS was started with EPUB in mind, it's really completely publication format agnostic. So for specialized dedicated format like DTBook, you could definitely use OPDS as well. And one question that we're starting to really think about is also, could this be used in addition, or could this be replaced? Could this replace the DAISY online delivery protocol? So that's a protocol that's used by a lot of libraries with special collections. But with OPDS, one could potentially imagine that those specific collections could be available to a larger number of reading apps, Thorium, for instance, or that the other way around, dedicated reading system for accessibility could also access OPDS, since nothing would be really blocking them to access this type of accessible content. So that's really something that is being debated currently in the ecosystem around OPDS, but I think there's something there to explore. If you'd like to learn more about OPDS, you can actually go on opds.io, where you'll get a lot of additional information about OPDS. So you can access all the specs there. We have validation tools. There are also a number of clients. And once again, if you want to look at a live demonstration of how this looks like, check the Thorium session that was on this morning. Or you can also just download any OPDS client available today. Or own Aldico is one of them, or if you're in the US, you can simply test Simply E. And that's it.
Thank you very much, Adrien. So, Michael, did you see some questions to ask?
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everyone. So the first question is from Ken. It's actually a question about LCP. What are all the steps that a publisher will need to apply in order to use LCP to protect a single title? And are there third parties who can supply this service?
That's probably more a question for Laurent than myself, although I can handle it if you like, Laurent.
Well, start. I will end if needed.
Sure. So LCP is an open specification. So first of all, anyone can look at the specification, and it's becoming an ISO standard. So if you're looking for information, it's freely available. There's also an open source LCP server implementation available on the Medium GitHub. So the first step would be to read about LCP. You can also there's also a lot of good information about it on the EDR Lab website. And once you start experimenting with LCP, you can then contact EDR Lab, which is in charge of the certification for LCP. And for LCP, there's a difference between what we call the test profile that you can use during your development, and then the production profile. To be in production with LCP, there's this notion of trusting various parties in the ecosystem, and that's what EDR Lab is for. So EDR Labs makes sure that everyone in the ecosystem implements LCP correctly, and provide you with additional information that you need to actually enable this production profile. Laurent?
Yes, I will just add that if it depends, in your question, I wasn't sure about the exact topic of your question, Ken, but if it is that you've got a book and you would like to expose it and expose it via LCP, yes, you will find LCP third parties already having installed an LCP server. And in the chat, I have put a link to a page on the EDR Lab website where we list those LCP adapters, including the third party who provide SaaS LCP services. So yes, there are already a bunch of companies who can host a book and provide it to everybody LCP protected.
So the next question is from Laurent. Will there be an OPDS 1.3, or is the 1.2 the last version using an XML structure?
Oh, that's a good one. So there won't be an OPDS 1.3. Basically, there are multiple reasons for OPDS 2. One of the reasons behind that is a lot of people don't want to work with XML anymore these days. So there's a lot of expectation from developers to just have everything as JSON. So that's one of the reasons why we've been moving to OPDS 2. But the fact that we've aligned with JSON-LD, schema.org, and the Medium Web Publication Manifest enables also a lot of additional things. So we have a lot more ways to structure a catalog now that we've moved to this model. We're able to have a lot more metadata expressed. And it's completely compatible with Readium Mobile. So for a developer creating a reading app, there's barely any difference between opening an EPUB file or working with an OPDS feed. In the end, the way your publication is represented is all the same. So for all those reasons, we really don't want to be maintaining two different versions. And OPDS 1.2 was really the last major release of OPDS based on XML.
Thank you, Adrien. The next question is from Laurent as well. Why is OPDS 2 still a draft, and what may change in its specification?
So it's a draft. One of the reasons why it's a draft is because Readium itself is still a moving target, in the sense that we are still making some minor tweaks to how Readium represents publications in general. And once the Readium Web Publication Manifest is fully stabilized, we'll probably stabilize and release do a full release for OPDS 2. So it wouldn't necessarily be a good idea to fully release OPDS 2 and then have to go back and do a 2.01 release because of minor tweaks on the Readium side. That's pretty much the reason for that.
The next question is from Michalis. Can someone use OPDS with other DRM schemes than LCP and social protection, such as Watermark?
Sure. So in the Simply E app, it's actually still using Adobe ACS. So the same way that OPDS is completely publication format agnostic, it's also completely DRM agnostic. So for OPDS, it's all links. So it's a link to buy, or it's a link to borrow, or it's a link to subscribe to. And then you have this concept of formats and DRM format. So it's entirely possible to actually have two links. So when you're viewing an OPDS publication, you could have one link for ACS, another for LCP, or a third link for the audiobook version. That is completely possible. And it's, of course, possible to have DRM-free content. A lot of OPDS catalogs out there are actually distributing public domain content or open access content that is completely DRM-free. So you're not forced to use DRM at all with OPDS. You can do whatever you want.
And the last question so far is from Laurent. Is there a plan to make OPDS 1 or 2 an international standard, stand by, for example, W3C or ISO?
That's a fair question. So far, it has been mostly maintained by a community of active contributors. So initially, O'Reilly, for instance, was really involved in the first few versions. Since 2015, NYPL, New York Public Library, has been really involved. So it has been more of a community standard than a true standard. But if we want to push forward certain use cases for OPDS, for example, use of OPDS by national libraries or similar use case, it could definitely make sense to go down that road. So it's not something that the community has worked on or has really considered so far, but we're definitely open to that idea. And I think that's something a lot of us would be happy to help with, especially if it can extend the use cases for OPDS to other types of organizations.
Thanks, Adrien. I think I went through all the questions.
So that's great. Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you, Adrien. If there is no other questions, we will stop there. I think that this presentation was very clear, and we will reuse it later, add it to the Idea Lab website when we speak about Rhodium, evolutions of Rhodium. So tomorrow you are invited to join two new webinars. One about accessibility metadata by Avnish Singh from the DAISY Consortium and Daniel Vec as moderator. And the other one in the afternoon about sizing the potential of visual narration by Patrick Müller from Studio DocMine. It's a studio who made something called the video book, something which is a bit like what we are trying to achieve with the Divina format. So something very interesting when we speak about future ways of communicating, well, content, book content. Thank you very much, and hope to see you tomorrow. Goodbye.
Goodbye, everyone.